We have the Buddha Fellows on also.
I had 7.
Yeah, we'll just wait. I'll say something and we'll wait for it. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome from the Alumni Association. As you can see, I have some of my committee members here with me, but and I can see we have already over 100 people attending this, though we have more than 300 who registered. So if you can just allow us for a couple of minutes so people can join in, and then we'll be ready to start. Yeah, Sanjeev. A quick question, Tony. The attendees will not be able to speak, correct? There'll be no audio for them.
Yes, Maya. The attendees will not be able to.
Yeah, so remember to say that when you're talking to them.
Yes.
They're saying they can't hear me. Is that true? Prajit? If I'm speaking, will they be able to hear me now?
Yeah, ma'am. I'm just chatting with the doctor. I'll just sort out this.
Maya, say something.
Yeah, they can all hear me. They can't see the other panelists. So maybe we can just show everyone on this panel right now, Prajit. Uh, the 5 people that I said no. So actually, you can put all the videos on of the people there and let them all see. Even though I'm only
Yes,
seeing.
ma'am.
Yeah. I'm just gonna wait for 1 more minute and then we'll start. Shall I start? Okay. Good evening, everyone, again. And I hope you can see and hear me. And I'm not sure if you can see all the other panelists, but you will get to see them, so do not worry. For those who don't know, my name is Dr. Maya Mascarenas. I'm the president of the Alumni Association of St. John's Medical College, Bangalore. And I'm really happy that we have the Dr. H.J. Mehta oration this evening. It's strange times in this corona epidemic. We normally have our orations on campus, well attended by people on campus, other Johnites, and other people in Bangalore. But it's strange not to be able to have, to be physically present with the orator. But I think in a way it's even more exciting because for this oration, we notice that we have people attending from all over the world. So I don't think we would have had that kind of an attendance if we had limited it only to our campus physical orations. So maybe there's a plus point in this whole epidemic. But enough talking from me. You're going to hear other people speak. And before I hand over, I must say I'm very, very thrilled that we have Dr. Yogesh Jain as our orator this time. Someone who I personally look up to as an actual epitome of a community health specialist and a role model for anyone who's interested in public health. But you'll hear much more about him. And now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Tony Raj, who's also part of the Alumni Association. He's the treasurer. He's also the dean of the St. John's Research Institute. And he's going to run past a few technical things that you maybe like to know because this is a virtual online. So Dr. Tony.
Thank you, Dr. Maya. Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us from various parts of the world. And welcome, Dr. Yogesh. Thank you for accepting to present this oration today. I'm here to just give you a brief on the webinar etiquette. Typically, most of you are familiar with Zoom. So as an attendee, you have options of just raising your hands, or there's a chat box. You really can't interact with your voice. As an oration, there are no questions that are typically asked to the speaker. However, if you do have any comments to our speaker, you could put it in your chat box and we'll collate it and share it with Dr. Jain at the end of the session. If you do have technical issues, just put it in the chat box. Our support team and coordinators are behind the scenes looking at it. They will reach out to you if you don't see the video or if you don't hear the audio. As attendees, once the slide share is made by the speaker, you will not see the video. You'll only see the slide and you'll hear the voiceover. So if you don't see the video of the speaker, just understand that this is the webinar mode. So you'll only see the slides and you will hear the speaker's voice. Right? If you do have any issues, put it on the chat and one of us will reach out to you to just engage with you through the chat to help resolve your technical issues. Right. Thank you, Maya.
Thanks a lot, Tony. We're now going to start in traditional St. John's mode, where I'm going to invite Sister Dr. Amita Lobo, who is also an executive member, to lead us in welcome and a prayer.
Good evening, everyone. We are extremely joyful to have this oration webinar in memory of Dr. H.J. Mehta, the professor of anatomy, who made St. John's proud in his days. We are very honored to have Dr. Yogesh Jain from Janaswasthya Sahayog, Bilaspur, a pediatrician, community health pioneer, and a devoted researcher. He has worked and still continues to work zealously with his team for the disadvantaged community at large. It is our privilege to have you with us, sir, this evening. Welcome, sir. A warm welcome to Dr. Sanjay Levin, the Chief of Medical Services, Dr. George, the Dean of St. John's Medical College, Dr. Tony Raj, the Dean of SJRI, and all the heads of various departments. It is our novel opportunity to be connected with alumni, colleagues, and friends of St. John's and Dr. Yogesh from all over the world. Welcome to all of you. As far as the tradition, we start this oration webinar with prayer, imploring the blessings of the Almighty. I kindly request all of you to pause for a while in prayerful silence and join me in this prayer. O Lord, throughout the ages, you have called men and women to render their lives in the service of humanity. We thank you for the person of late Dr. H.J. Mehta, who our alma mater cherishes and still remembers. May he be our inspiration during this COVID pandemic, inculcate his ethical values, and to work selflessly in caring for the suffering humanity. Bless our orator, Dr. Yogesh Jain, and all of us present. May we be inspired to serve humanity with dedication and in the spirit of selfless service. Enable us to learn from those who have committed their lives for this noble cause. At this moment, we bring before you all the victims of COVID-19. By your grace, may we soon see an end of this pandemic and thus world be restored of its health and wholeness. All glory and praise to you, O Lord, now and forever. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Sister Amita. And on with the oration straight away. We start with introducing Dr. H.J. Mehta, who I'm very happy I had the privilege of knowing, but many of the first few batches of St. John's will remember him much better. And to introduce him, we have Dr. Yogita Ravindranath from the Department of Anatomy. Yogita.
Okay, what is the routine showing you?
Thank you, Dr. Maya. Very good evening to one and all. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. H.J. Mehta.
All the prescriptions. Don't keep sending one small bit here and there.
The Alumni Association organizes the H.J. Mehta Memorial Oration to perpetuate the memory of one of the most illustrious teachers of St. John's Medical College. Dr. Hasmukh Jetlal Mehta, that is H.J. Mehta, was the first professor to join the college when he started the MBBS classes in July 1963, and he was chairman of anatomy. He laid the foundation of Department of Anatomy at St. John's Medical College, built it up into one of the finest departments of its kind in the country. Born on 6th October 1923 in Saurashtra, Gujarat, he led a brilliant scholastic career, topping his class in MBBS examination of the Bombay University. He obtained his MSc Anatomy from the Gujarat University and then worked at the St. Anne's Hospital of John Carroll University and Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland. To improve medical education, he spent a considerable amount of his energy to update teaching methods. Though he was known to be a strict disciplinarian, his students loved him and he was admired by his staff and colleagues. His knowledge of the subject was immense and he had an intense interest in keeping abreast of recent advances. He combined this with an insatiable thirst of knowledge of the allied health sciences and subjects of general interest, whether it was history of medicine, economics, politics, or sociology. Dr. Mehta was constantly exploring better and newer teaching methods. He was an active member of many learned societies and had any bearing on anatomy, human biology, and cytogenetics. He had, to his credit, many valuable papers based on his diverse research interest. He attended many international and national conferences and presented papers. His research interests included anthropology, genetics, embryology, histochemistry, and anatomy. Dr. Mehta was the principal investigator and co-investigator in many of the projects which are aided by Indian Council of Medical Research and State Board of Medical Research. Even in those days, he encouraged his staff, students, and technicians to publish papers. Unfortunately, in August 1973, he died as a result of a tragic accident right at the college gate. That day, the medical fraternity lost an excellent teacher, a man of warm friendship. However, the memory of this dynamic personality, loved by one and all who knew him, is immortal. Thank you very much. Over to you, Maya. Thank you.
Yogita, thanks. Thank you, Dr. Yogita. And like we said, Dr. H.J. Mehta was a very special person. And it is in his memory that this oration was started many years ago. And the Alumni Association is very happy to be able to continue this. Now, to introduce our illustrious speaker, we have none other than a good friend of the speaker and a good, well-known person in St. John's, my junior by 1 year, but now a big man in St. John's, Dr. Sanjeev Loy. You're on mute, Sanjeev. Yeah.
Yep. Good evening, all those in India, and welcome to this webinar. It is my pleasure to really introduce somebody who we all look up to, the ultimate pediatrician. And he presented a paper, Small People, Big Problems, during a conference on health problems among the bottom billion at the Harvard School in March 2011. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to introduce our orator, a small person dealing with big problems. Yogesh Jain is an MBBS doctor and an MD pediatrician, and a founding member of the Jan Swastha Sahyog. He graduated from All India Institute, doing his undergraduate and postgraduate in pediatrics finally, and became a senior resident and assistant professor between 1991 and 1999. During this time, a group of 4 of them, if not 5 of them, began to dream of a possible different type of route to take, unlike the usual All India Institute graduate. And this is where the Jan Swastha Sahyog began, the idea, the seed. So these were a group of postgraduates in All India Institute who were working as senior residents who decided to do something very different. They decided that their motto, their vision was in thought, faith, in deed, courage, and in life, service. And they focused on developing a low-cost and effective health program for the rural and tribal areas of Chhattisgarh. At that time, it was Madhya Pradesh. They also strongly believed that it was important to access healthcare irrespective of who, what, when, how much money, what religion, what social class you came from. They traveled to Ganyari, 134 kilometers northeast of Raipur, very near Bilaspur in Chhattisgarh, which is now Chhattisgarh, at that time Madhya Pradesh, and were handed over 15 terrible looking debilitated buildings called the Irrigation Colony in Ganyari village outside Bilaspur. The Madhya Pradesh government was very happy to hand it over to them, and they converted the buildings on the left-hand side to the buildings on the right-hand side into a full-fledged hospital, which is overcrowded because its population is really desperate for good quality healthcare. It is believed that you have to wait 3 to 5 days camping outside the outpatient to get a registration slip to attend the outpatient, let alone getting admitted. Just one visit to JSS Hospital in Ganyari really changed a lot of our minds, and a lot of our young students who were mentored there in their short burst really came back totally motivated. Publications are also very special, with 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 Yogesh completing nearly 75 publications. My favorite, of course, is his Chronicles from Central India, which he has published as an atlas of rural health, a wonderful source of information, very relevant to practices where it matters. They've also worked on a lot of low cost technology. And of course, I was fortunate to get a teaching stethoscope, which I could use because it was a double head stethoscope for me to teach. Of course, the inverted syringe for inverted lipids, the electronic weighing scale, a package for delivery, for clean delivery, for animal bite identification, and how to manage a rapid reckoner. And of course, my favorite, one of my two favorites, is using mosquito nets as a hernia repair, as you can see in the picture in the center. My favorite exciting one was, of course, electrophoresis, because when I first saw it with him, I don't recall St. John's lab having electrophoresis at that time. Our samples used to go out. And here in Ganyari, he was doing electrophoresis mainly because of the tribal population having tremendous amounts of sickle cell anemia. Other interesting inventions were ultraviolet sterilization of water using a bicycle, and of course a first aid kit with even contraptions made out of bamboo to enable rapid improvement in care. Of course, it's important to keep these numbers and this email very simply because it is one lifetime experience to spend time with them, to realize what they do and what we could do if we decide at any time in our life to do something so special as what the JSS led by Yogesh has done so far. His strength remains his wife, who is a pediatrician in JSS, and I guess all good pediatricians marry pediatricians. Of course, he has two young daughters who are also earning. One is already in medical school, and one is waiting for the exam to join him and his wife in the practice of medicine somewhere in the world. Yogesh Jain, to summarize, has been quoted to have begun a model of excellence for rural health in central India. He has created cost-effective healthcare for over 3 lakh of tribal populations. He's opened over 100 rural creches, and he has trained local villagers to man sub-centers who will deliver first aid before they need to be brought to a hospital. He has developed many cost-effective technologies, and his team has gone on to even document observations in an atlas of rural health. And with this, I'm sure we are waiting to listen to our orator, and we hope we have the courage to follow. I give you Yogesh Jain, pediatrician and founding member of the Jan Swastha Sahyog, and we're so proud that he's going to give our oration today. Over to you, Yogesh, and we look forward to this brilliant oration we intend to listen to.
So Yogesh, the stage is all yours now.
All right. So, are my slides visible now or no?
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet. Share.
Okay.
Now it will be visible.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So, thanks for these very special words, Sanjeev, and the rest of the alumni of the St. John's Medical College. As a student of medicine, when I joined in '82 in Delhi, I was especially, I was, taken in by the special training that used to happen in St. John's, and I must share that I cut my teeth in public health due to my association with Johnites who are now in the alumni, and I've learned a lot of community medicine through my association with so many Johnites. And it's indeed a privilege for me to be able to speak for Dr. H.J. Mehta's in his memory today, when I know that what he brought, he was a teacher of all these Johnites whom I learned about public health in the beginning. And they tell me that, you know, it was passion that he brought out maximum in the practice and learning of medicine. And I would like to share here today some of the things and how I have learned public health through a sample size of one, which means through the clinic window. How can one learn community health and develop passion for health at large? So I must say that, you know, to recap I have been a doctor like many of you who are in the audience. Trained. I was also a good student in my own batch, but was also interested in, you know, the whys and hows of ill health, and not just fixing medical and medical problems. And thus that I went from where most people with illnesses used to come, that was from rural India. So I relocated to rural India. And what guided me then, as it guides me now, is the extreme sense, the inequality in our world, and which is due to injustice that people suffer from. And I'm a great follower of the physicians of Rudolf Virchow, who said that if deprivation is the cause of most illnesses, then physicians become the natural attorneys of the poor. And thus we relocated ourselves to to Chhattisgarh, then in Madhya Pradesh, which I would say is the epicenter of underdevelopment, with eastern Madhya Pradesh, eastern Maharashtra, north Telangana, western and southern Orissa, and western Jharkhand being among the poorest places in the country, where access to health, as evidenced by distance from most public health facilities, as well as and this is in a forested area in Chhattisgarh, where the weights of people was a marker of their hunger status, with weights of 41 kilos and 49 kilos being the median weights for women and men, adult men and women, where there was also a pecking order in the hunger status, with the primitive tribes, particularly vulnerable tribal groups, and then the ordinary tribal groups, then the Dalits and the backward caste, having showing a pecking order of through their nutritional status. As you can see, the BMI is being varying from 18.3 to increasing to 19 in the non-backward caste. So where we started, as Sanjeev was trying to say, in a rural agroforestry economy, we ran a 3-tiered health system, which was where 3,000 people accessed the referral center that we run in Ganyari. And at the second level, we run the outreach clinics, where 150 people from 150 forest range villages, which are mainly Adivasi villages, would access. And in 72 villages, we ran an intensive village health worker program with a population of 38,500, where running a clinic, wards, running a low-cost pharmacy, and using the laboratory as an important component of health, with microbiology, this rough, tough, and the buff in terms of the TB bacteria, or doing cultures of the water that we drink, or even taking the laboratory to the people with a microscope, a colorimeter, and a centrifuge, being enough to run most lab services in the community. Where despecialization of, this is a pediatrician doing anesthesia, or health workers using a teaching stethoscope to learn, and also to check whether someone has learned correctly or not. And our focus has been on primary healthcare, primary healthcare is defined as healthcare for common and important health problems, with equity and affordability as the guiding underpins, and acting on the determinants where cost, quality, and access remain equally important. And we believed very strongly from the first few years that primary healthcare is not just primary level care. If primary healthcare could also be tertiary or secondary also, say a snake bite requires ventilation, then it would become high level secondary care. Or if a patient with severe malaria gets into renal failure and requires dialysis and requires intensive care, then that is tertiary level care and is so-called appropriate tertiary care. Tertiary level care, but primary care still. And primary healthcare is not second-rate medicine for the have-nots. You can't be giving ampicillin to your own child and give cotrimoxazole to a child who's poor. And they're not straight-jacketed protocols, trivialized protocols and regimes that we may be learnt. We may be feeling that those are the things for the others who get it. So my thesis in this has been that public health is not fundamentally different from clinical medicine as we practice on an individual level. And the essential problem in public health has been that there's been a lack of underpinning of equity in the interventions. So if we define, if we posit individual health and public health as opposed to each other, the yardsticks, ethics and goals actually are similar. It is a continuum going from an individual person, and community health would be health of the entire community. The tools may be different. Like you may be using surveys and FGDs when you're trying to do health at the community level, whereas a clinical examination and using a laboratory would be the skills you would do it at the individual level. The scale may be different, and in finding solutions to public health problems, simple solutions are obviously the best. But if the optimal solution is complex, so be it. You can't scale up by dumbing down. And that should be a guiding principle for all our work that we are trying to do. And I would here like to bring out what I've tried to say often before, that doctors, good doctors in public health could be of three types. The type 1 doctor is one who listens to the problems of a single patient in a clinic, does a good examination, advises the right amount of investigations, the barest minimum that would give the diagnosis adequately, put everything together, diagnose the problem, and then offers treatment in form of medicines and counseling, and heals the body and the mind. Something like and my good type 1 doctor would be who is multi-skilled in various types of problems and is not a prisoner of one specialty of medicine. It's something like a Kishore Kumar type of a physician for me, who knows everything from singing, music to acting to directing. So this is my type 1 doctor. A good doctor, type 1 doctor would be one who's in a medical college faculty looking at individual patients. And as much as one is looking at a lot of people, one is doing public health, and that's a good public health, and also teaching students then. My type 2 doctor, good public health doctor, is one who not only tries to do this diagnosis and healing the body and mind, but is also addressing the whys and hows of ill health. So why would, if there are 4 people coming with gastroenteritis from a single cluster of villages, then to find out whether the water that they're drinking is bad or not, or and then fixing it, or if someone is finding a lot of undernutrition coming from a particular cluster of villages, then one would say whether the land holdings are smaller, or whether the people are suffering with infections there, or there is some other issue to handle. The PDS is not working there. It's still the whys and hows of ill health. A typical community medicine faculty member in a medical school or most voluntary organization would be doing this type 2 doctor to work. My type 3 doctor is who's acting one on more basic determinants of health, which would be sometimes even called political questions. So if there is a poor health of people in Bastar, is it because we are not able to, we are not to see why government has taken over land from people, and therefore there is people have less land, and therefore they don't have enough earning from their thing. Or if most people are not able to access drugs because the drugs are too expensive, then one is to work on ensuring drug pricing which is adequate, which ensures that everyone gets drugs free of cost and without becoming poor. And that is a more political type of work, but more basic determinants of health. So I would rate myself as someone who's doctor 2.5, more than 2, but not 3. I have some friends attempted a type 3 doctor's thing, and I think we can move in life from 0.5 to 1 to 2.2 to 2.5 or 3, depending upon our interest and our abilities. And this is a question that came to me early, which Archbishop Camara said in Brazil in 1980s. When I gave food to the hungry, they called me a saint. But when I asked why they were hungry, they called me a communist. And if that is the case, then I would very proudly call myself a communist if asking why people are hungry is being a communist. So my journey in public health has been from looking at individual health, the pediatrician that I was, to looking health in the community, to public health, from curative to add to make it preventive also, from intuitive learning that one always does when one is growing up as a physician, to evidence-based or non-intuitive paradigm also, from service work, just healing body, minds, and running community programs, to training middle-level workers and advocacy for poor people's health problems. From healthcare only to working on social determinants has been the part of the journey, and using simple human technology to using information technology also. And as I said, the biggest problem that we realized was that there was lack of underpinning of equity in public health intervention. And whether we should, this is a question that we should we weigh in for efficiency or for equity? And or should it be also considered effectiveness and humanity in our interventions? So this question about equity and cost effectiveness comes to us, whether we are looking at us, the issue interventions for ourselves or for an amorphous community where we would even cut corners. And the problem is that people who make decisions about interventions often don't bear the consequences of their own decisions, and the people who suffer these consequences don't have a voice. So most public health interventions, therefore, have sometimes use baseless presumptions because there is inadequate information available about the causes and the other determinants of that go into public health intervention. And GOBSAT is the way to go forward. Good old boys sat around the table, including even in this COVID outbreak. We know that there is a manual that it's essentially a manual that is determining the COVID-19 task force in the country. And excuses of size, of complexity and expense often guide public health interventions in this country. So I would like to now, in the next few minutes, take few examples of my sample size of one as single patients that I saw, how they taught me how to think about public health from a clinical window, and to take on forward to the various multipliers that I try to use through training, advocacy, and observational research. So falciparum malaria is a problem for most central Indian things. The problem is coming down. It is in fact getting replaced or even added by problems of scrub typhus and dengue and chikungunya and other vector-borne diseases. But we know that tribals in India, even though they're 8% of the total population, but 50% of falciparum malaria, of all deaths, and 70% of all falciparum malaria are seen among the tribals. And ecology, and obviously because people who are staying away furthest from healthcare are the ones who suffer. And a colleague of mine who said, malaria deaths start where political power ends. So we saw this over time, and we saw that we asked this question in malaria, if a person came with fever, it's possible for a person in an off-the-road village to get a report for a blood smear for malaria in good time, which would mean something within 24 hours, so that a right treatment can be given. And it is not that everyone with fever gets chloroquine or in these days artesunate combination treatment. And the second question would be that, can we prevent overdiagnosis and can we also discover whether there is emerging drug resistance to the drugs that we are using? So in this case, a lab, as we thought, could go to the patient rather than, it's almost like Muhammad going to the mountain, or can the mountain go to Muhammad? And we can have shotgun therapy. So we trained our health workers to make blood smears, and to even those who are illiterate to fill pictorial forms. So this is a health worker going to a family of a person who's running fever. She examines and makes smears, dries them, thick smears I'm talking about, and gives it to school children who go to the main road villages. The children in high school, there are very few high schools in smaller villages. So they were carrying these slides, blood smear on glass slides, and then with pictorial forms put into soap boxes. They would take them to the main road villages where there will be buses flying from rural India into urban India in the morning hours, where they would carry various soap boxes full of blood smears from different villages to the health center, which is on a main road, and where you would pick up the slide boxes from the buses and stain them on priority, and this would be reported by a doctor or by a lab technician, and the reports sent back in when the buses to rural India return in the evening on the return journey, and then by this time the school children are about to go back to home. They would take the reports back and take decisions which they would communicate to the health worker whether they should give the right medicine, or if it is not malaria, then whether she should refer depending upon the other problems. And thus we have been able to run this and people their diagnosis in time, as well as on day 3 if you could do the blood smear and check whether these parasites have disappeared, knowing whether there is any resistance developing to the even including artesunate combination treatment. And we could this way also monitor whether the malaria, what is the season of malaria. When I was learning at AIIMS as a medical student, we were taught that malaria was a problem of the rainy season. But when we looked at every year, when we monitored every patient's blood smear, we realized that the outbreak peaked. Malaria was a seasonal problem, and peaking was in November. So I remember as a young teacher, I would have considered a student's performance poor if someone had said that the malaria was a problem of early winters, which is the case in entire rural India, central India. And I've even checked out data now that it was common even in Punjab in the months of November and October. Similarly, we've realized that in a 2010 outbreak, that the maximum peak of malarial deaths were in the last weeks of October and November, early November. And that was a time when the IDSP reported no deaths due to that. So actually, if you collect data adequately and use your labs correctly, you can call out and say whether that malaria, what is the seasonality of malaria and when should you do this. And if you remember, the malaria month, the country is celebrated in the middle of June, when I think we see the least amount of malaria. Obviously questioning our strategies in controlling vector-borne diseases. I would go to the next question about tuberculosis, particularly in Chhattisgarh, which is only typical of poor areas of the country. The other MDR, not multi-drug resistant, but malnutrition, diabetes, and retrovirus in that order, as accounting for tuberculosis associations in Chhattisgarh and other poor parts of the country. So this is the story of a middle-aged gentleman called Dhanga Baiga, belonging to a particularly vulnerable tribal groups, who came and visited us in the clinic with these problems which were suggestive of tuberculosis. And you have to agree that you have to believe me that this figure shows a weight of 28.5 kilos at 52 years of age, and he had a height of 163 centimeters. And this person, we treated him according to the body weight. It's like pediatricians, treating adult patients. We gave him drugs according to the body weight rather than an adult weight. That would have caused toxicity to him. And yet we lost him 6 weeks later, in spite of starting treatment, because of inadequate response and also a superadded infection. And we realized that why food in tuberculosis was critically important. We looked at the weights and the heights of all our patients in that period, and we saw that these are the weights of people, or the appearances of people that we saw. And this is a family of 3, a father, son, and a daughter, all down with tuberculosis, sputum positive at the same time. And we looked at the data in the first few years of our work, and we realized that the weights, median weights of men was 42 kilos. That means 49% people weighed less than 42 kilos, and in the weights of women was 34.1. This is the weights of people, and I'm reasonably sure that these are the weights of other. It is not specific to Ganyari or to Chhattisgarh. but would be common in other parts of central India also, with almost normal heights, and the median BMI was 16. So, we had even 15% people who had weights BMIs of lower than 13 also. So, and women have BMI of 15. So, with these weights, we realized that undernutrition, as we know, can cause more extensive disease, higher risk of death, higher risk of drug toxicity, risk of absorption, and higher risk of relapse. And we re-looked at the Madras trial that we have learned all in our graduate days, where they had shown that, domiciliary treatment would be as good in terms of sputum conversion rates. But if you look at the later outcomes, the weight gains of women who were in domiciliary treatment was only 2 pounds, as opposed to 11 pounds when they were in a sanatorial care. So the importance of weight of food was misjudged by the Madras trial, and I think that they did a disservice to an entire generation of physicians, of which I was also one of them. When we started looking at data, how food improved, treatment for tuberculosis. So cure rates in Haiti went from 56.7 to 100% if they provided food and some amount of other support services. And death rates came down, and weight gains, you can see these are the weight gains that were seen. So, we argued this on this basis, and were able to get additional food for all our TB patients for the entire state of Chhattisgarh. And when I tried to argue this at the central level in the central government, where we had a chance to present, it was a joint secretary who said, I will not give food to the people. But we were able at some level argue out and then get this measly grant of 500 rupees per month for TB patients tuberculosis patients has been finally agreed upon by the state at the central level. But I must say here that even as a pediatrician, undernutrition has been talked about, and whenever one thinks of undernutrition, one thinks about undernutrition in children as the primary problem, as the largest problem that should be handled. When we know that the largest number of population largest proportion are adults, and no one seems to talk about adult undernutrition. So there is a sort of a whitewashing of adult undernutrition, because adult undernutrition gets in political questions. Why land holdings are smaller? Why PDS is not working? Why should some people have less food to eat? So as a pediatrician, we got adult undernutrition back into focus. And JSS, my hospital clinic, is one of the few hospitals in the country where everyone is weighed from birth to elderly age every time they come to a hospital, and their heights are also taken. When I worked at AIIMS, I remembered that only the pediatric ward and the outpatients had weighing scales. My internal medicine wards had old bathroom scales which were under a table and which would be brought out when they saw an obviously undernourished person. So, and we have, as physicians, sanitized the word to call it malnutrition or undernutrition. Why don't we call it by the word that it is really meaning? So my third problem, I would say, is there was a young man, 24 years old, who took 6 months of anti-tubercular treatment. This is in 2003, with the then recommendation of intermittent treatment of 2 drugs for 4 months, intermittently taken twice a week, with 2 drugs given for 4 months in 2003. This young man responded slowly but surely. He became sputum negative at 2 months of treatment, and we could stop his treatment at 6 months. He relapsed 8 months post-stopping, and we asked the question, why did he do that? So we looked at our data and found that children were doing well, because I, as a pediatrician, was always giving a regular daily treatment to all children. But we found there were 33 relapses among 420 adults. That was almost 8% of people. So we looked at the WHO recommendation, WHO, who is the transnational daddy of public health, and we saw the recommendations. They had no bibliography in their recommendation, and they recommended one-size-fits-all treatment for everyone. So we fought with WHO in 2006 as a team, and with the Central TB division in 2008 to 2013, arguing whether that we should give daily treatment. We looked at the data from the rest of the literature, and we published a review arguing for daily treatment in areas where INH resistance is common, like India, and published a review also. And when we launched, we found that we were not getting through in academic circles or in administrative circles. We went to the Supreme Court. We finally won the case in January 2017 when we filed a PIL, and we got a doctor in Delhi to argue our case. And the regime was finally changed in September 2017 to daily treatment for everyone in the country, as it is happening now. And yeah. So this agony of this consumption, as tuberculosis should ideally be called, who advises the government which regimes should be done? Why don't our leaders see reason in this or in time? And why no supplemental food even now? And in that sense, I would allege that our academia has failed the people by not taking on issues that are most important for people. And tuberculosis certainly is one of the largest issues that we should see. Food is important not only for tuberculosis but for other illnesses that are related to hunger. So I would like to take another question about this man, Jethuram Uike. He came in, whom I had been seeing, for 10 years regularly. He lost 1 unit BMI, 1 unit point BMI from 17.5 to 16.5 in 2013, and he came with a cough of some duration. He was sputum positive, and then detected to have a blood sugar of which is so high as this, sputum positive and diabetes. And he was slow in responding, but required metformin plus insulin for his diabetes control. And the question that was very obvious was, why did he have diabetes at age of 35 when he was so undernourished? Which was a faulty lifestyle he had led. He was not taking tobacco, no weight gain, was working every day of his life till he became sick, and he had no HIV. And when we looked at his food habits, the oil intake that he and his family were taking was 11 grams per day, and there were no fruits. So we realized that this is a different type of diabetes that we were seeing. And then we looked at literature. Someone as early as 1963 had reported about lean diabetes in Orissa. And we realized that when we looked at the weights and heights of all our diabetes, 80% of them either had low weight or had normal weights. Only 20% of our diabetes patients had BMIs of over 23. So we call this low body weight type 2 diabetes and malnutrition modulated diabetes mellitus. This was not MODY. This was not early onset type 2. And they had the features of both type 1 and type 2. And majority occurred in hardworking poor people. And they had earlier complications of neuropathy, infectious complications, and very often 50% of them required insulin at the beginning of treatment. And when we looked at their median weights was 43 and 40 kilos in men and women, and their heights of 159 and 151 centimeters. So this lean diet, as we now call, as when by observation. So as I said, instead of 80 now is 70% that we have BMIs lower than 23. 40% have BMIs lower than 18.5 also. 50% require insulin early. Blood sugars are between high, like type 1 diabetes, 400 to 600 at present. Median age of 42, 10 years earlier than most type 2 diabetes. Difficult to classify this illness. This is not FCPD. This is not a delayed presentation of type 1. And what about this set of advice that we give? More exercises, do yoga, and eat less. Will it work for these people? And why can't we look at how poor people live and die? We went on to, communitization of healthcare as our work, developing health outposts called health and wellness centers. In fact, that is the idea that came from our program that has been taken on at the national level as a final look of healthcare, where you would have a non-physician health worker looking after this thing. And also we feel that, in the absence of physicians going to rural India, we would be very well placed to manage with mid-level health workers to manage all the problems. And thirdly, we also found that peer support groups led by a facilitator and expert would be working So we have been working on mid-level health worker to develop human resources for disadvantaged people and physicians' role, but certainly, but a limited role that we feel because they would not be there. Doctors are not going to go to rural areas in any significant numbers, period. Maybe Johnites would do, but I'm not sure about how many others would go. We don't have a model for care for NCDs in this country or in the world, I would say. And even if we can claim that MCH and infections can be managed at community and clinic level, and this space is at the moment taken by informal practitioners. So mid-level health providers can contribute to MCH and infections care also besides NCD care. And ASHA can do much, but only so much. They cannot be a Durga. ASHA should remain ASHA. And we need to break the hegemony of physicians in public health. And I feel mid-level health workers can do this work. One other issue that I would like to focus with the group that we are here today is about drug prices that we've been working on. We realize that 70% of cost of healthcare is accounted for by drugs. And purchasing drugs for care is a cause of impoverishment and in a lot of people. And 35% of deaths that we realized which happened in our program villages, they did not even consult anyone for illnesses that killed them. Obviously, because the scare of medical indebtedness makes people scared away from seeking healthcare. And progressively, drugs were getting decontrolled prices of drugs were getting decontrolled in 2000 till 2003 when we filed this special leave petition in the Supreme Court. So even for an expense of only 42 rupees for a month's treatment in 2003, people had to take loans to get treatment in our hospital. And we realized that the drug pricing, albendazole, which we sell at to 1 rupee in our clinic, is available in the market for 12 to 15 rupees. Amlodipine for 40 paise, and it is 1 rupee 50 paise to 6 rupees in the rest of the market. So there are rip-off prices that are happening. So and we knew that the Tamil Nadu government was able to provide drugs to almost all their people in their state at the prices that they could negotiate, which was so albendazole, as you know, is 12 rupees in the market. In JSS it is 1 rupee, and Tamil Nadu buys it for 22 paise. And I'm sure the people who sell it to Tamil Nadu state government are not selling it out of any charity. They are also earning a profit even when they sell it to Tamil Nadu. So we understood how drug pricing is done and how it should be done. So we filed a petition in 2003 and got a stay, and finally a judgment in 2014 which said all drug prices will be controlled, in all essential drugs prices controlled in the country. But they made a mess of the pricing formula which we are trying to work on and fight with this thing. So so we have been also working. This is a new thing that we have been able to do in the last few years. Has to form peer support groups based on patients with chronic similar problems, with common problems, so that they can look after their problems together. And it is the role of the physician reduced. The patient's agency in this work has increased. So 54 such patient groups we have been forming for alcohol dependence, for diabetes, hypertension, mental illnesses, epilepsy, sickle cell disease, airborne contact dermatitis, rheumatoid arthritis, and asthma, and so these groups meet once a month. They share their news, support compliance issues among each other, play and do some physical activity, do some microfinance, but also advocate for people for their problems with the community. And from these peer support groups, the possibility is that the disadvantaged groups can be empowered to act as health coaches and as public health advocates. Patient group-centered care can achieve so much that professional care can never achieve. So, and we realize that without these peer support groups, the compliance with drugs in chronic diseases can never reach more than 50%. With our patient support groups, we are able to reach compliance in chronic illnesses like hypertension, diabetes, mental illnesses to over 90%, and epilepsy also. So I would like to mention here for our surgical colleagues, surgery is a typical stepchild of public health. We know that when there is no doctor, there is often no nurse. But even where there is a doctor, there is often no surgeon. And we realize that surgical problems are a significant part of problems when we did a study of 1 month compared to MCH problems, and NCDs are low, but surgical requirements are large. And thus, we have been also working on ensuring that leprosy, the cell X is due. I'm not so sure whether how much time I have, but I would try to work on a little bit of leprosy. National Leprosy Eradication Program actually ordered a virtual elimination of leprosy and a real elimination of concern for patients in 2005, when the WHO changed its goalposts, and elimination of leprosy in 2005, was, they defined it not only by the absence of incidence, but by reduction of prevalence, which was, I think, which was something chicanery that was done. So the treatment was shortened from 12 months to 24 months to 12 months, and the cleaning of registers was done. So, and on a predetermined date, leprosy was declared eliminated, and when the prevalence supposed to come down to less than 1 per 10,000. So, this decision was taken on a more change in funding practices rather than in ground realities. Often see still a lot of leprosy every day. And so we have about 140 to 150 new patients coming with leprosy, 70% of them as on the leprometers poll coming to clinics like in Chhattisgarh. A word about blood in rural areas. 98% blood banks in India are in cities where 31% people stay. And the regulatory regime has decided that blood will not be available to rural India because it is easier to control fewer organizations like blood banks rather than to allow individual small units, so small clinics to bleed donors and transfuse them when necessary after having tested also adequately. So it has been done because the system does not want even a single HIV transmission, which is true. We don't want it. But to confront regulation and access, can regulation trump access to a problem? Is a issue that I would question that I would ask, and I would say clearly we have to ensure access whenever we are. The regulatory regime has to become correct rather than fill access in the garb of controlling of the convenience of regulators. Finally, I would say in life we have to make choices, and taking sides with the people is what we should do. So one thing that we feel that all of us who are working in clinical or in public health should be trying to do is unearthing trivialization of rural people's health problems, whether it is about rheumatic heart disease, which we continue to still see in the poorer parts of the country, tuberculosis, or blood, or birthing care, and even food and hunger and undernutrition is something that we should work on. So, what are the choices before a professional in an unequal and unjust world? Choices could be that you could be against the people and clearly side with the power, or you will be passive. Okay, you will not do any harm, but you will not take side with the people. Or you could be mentally active, support other attempts at being with on side people. Or you could be physically active and working on with the people. So paths taken in the public health have included Norman Bethune, if you know, this Canadian surgeon who went to China and set up, worked in their civil war situation, helping people, and died there of sepsis. Che Guevara obviously took the type of doctor's work and worked in Cuba from his Argentinian country. Pramod Upadhyay is a colleague of mine who's been developing technology because he as a chemist and an immunologist started developing appropriate technology in healthcare. Arole started some of the community health workers' work, which led to support the ASHA program also coming up later. Paul Biondich is a physician who started doing the open MRS, and now there are better open source software. Arvind Eye Institute is one. Paul Farmer worked at the UN level for NCDs as one of the strongest proponents of equity care for complex problems. And Abhay and Rani Bang is someone also who has spoken with you. So whether small is beautiful or big for impact is a choice that we all have to make in our type of physician that we want to become. Asking the right questions, this is something that we should continue to do. And I would argue, asking the question, what is the burden of diseases that poor people in India live with and die due to? What is the healthcare package that should be there at each level of health facility? Technicals in care of tuberculosis are so many, and in malaria, food and illnesses, something where you should ask, why don't we have price control over essential drugs? Should tertiary care be supported? I would say, but a certain type of appropriate tertiary care. How should we handle NCTs at a community level? Is there any role of conditional cash transfers, institutional delivery strategy? What is the best way of forward for human resources in health? Finally, I would end with this privatization. I would like to handle with people, with Johnites. Privatization for me, direct outsourcing or private-public partnership and private practice by people is all the same thing, and it has not worked. It is clear that privatization of health has not worked anywhere in the world. And in an unequal society, public financing and overwhelming public healthcare has to be provided by the public system. We can't avoid criticism of the public system because it is an attempt to correct it, but we can't throw the baby along with the bathwater if we criticize the public system. And universal health care and not coverage is the only way that we can say. I would end by this statement from the Harry Potter's book. It is the choices that show what we truly are more than abilities. Thank you for giving me this time. Thank you.
Phew. Well, Yogesh, I think everyone's going to be saying, what just happened? We've got a complete overview of the public health situation here in India, and you could have not had anyone better than Yogesh Jain explaining this to you, and not some theoretical explanation or an academic explanation, but a real life experiential one. So, I mean, that was just amazing. I think he touched upon so many public health issues, and which are not only for community medicine specialists. You know, it's just for any person. You don't even have to be a doctor, but if you are involved in any sphere that can touch health in some way, I think your inspiration from JSS experience is invaluable. And I really second Sanjeev Lewin's thing is, if you ever get a chance, go and visit them and really see it firsthand and experience. Thank you really very much, Yogesh. And before I hand over to Dr. Tony again, I just want to say that Yogesh's relationship with St. John's goes beyond just mentoring some of the medical students who have gone there, but he also gave the keynote address at one of the Golden Jubilee events in 2013, but goes further back to when he actually was in AIIMS, and then the Bhopal gas tragedy happened, and that's when he went to volunteer, and he met with two Johnites there, Dr. Ravi and Dr. Thelma Narayan, and was quite involved in some of the work done there during the Bhopal gas tragedy incidents. But I think Yogesh left us with a set of fantastic questions that can be used not only for research and for academic people, but for all people interested in anything to do with community health. So thanks a lot again, Yogesh. That was just brilliant. I'm now going to ask Dr. Tony, as part of our oration procedures or process, we always honor our orating speaker, our speaker, with a small little memento. We did send it to him, but I mean, today is a public holiday, and it's sitting there in the courier office in Bilaspur in his home, but not with him. So Tony is going to do the honors.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you very much, Dr. Yogesh. Truly inspirational talk, and we are very privileged to have you present this at this Dr. H.D. Mehta oration. On behalf of the St. John's Medical College Alumni Association and the entire St. John's family, I'd like to symbolically hand over this plaque that we put together. I'm not sure if everyone can see it, but this is what we have sent to you, and you will receive it shortly. So thank you so much for presenting this and highlighting the inequities in health and how you've been fighting it and solving it at your level. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Tony. And Yogesh, I do hope you do get the plaque, at least on Monday. And before we end the formal thank yous, I want to say again a big shout out to all my Johnite colleagues in outside India, in the North American hemisphere, and the others, and for all the others. So I know from CMC Vellore and from Delhi and from many other institutions who have attended this oration. I'm sure you've been inspired. Thanks for being there with us. And I now hand over for the formal vote of thanks to Dr. Robert Anthony, the Vice President of the Alumni Association.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yogesh Jain. Thanks to a man who has literally walked the talk, and he has taken world-class healthcare to the most unreached parts of our country. Something that we talk about in Johns, and a lot of our Johnite alumni are doing that work. But to see such a giant of a man be here with us to share his experience today. Thank you, Dr. Yogesh Jain. Thank you for sharing your challenging vision of JSS and your own personal journey. Hearing it firsthand is an inspiration. And I know that this will continue to inspire youngsters and old doctors for decades to come. This H.J. Mehta oration is one of the prime events in our alumni calendar, and you, sir, have greatly enriched it today. Thank you. I wish to thank the management of St. John's and our Dean, Dr. George D'Souza, Dr. Tony Raj, Dr. Sanjeev Lewin, Dr. Anuradha, Dr. Bobby Joseph, Dr. John Stephen, Dr. Mary Dias, Dr. Mary Joseph, Dr. Praveen Rodriguez, our ex-president, and of course our dynamic president, Dr. Maya Mascarenhas, and her team. And a special shout out to Dr. Sister Amita and Dr. Rakesh Ramesh. I also spied our alumni, sister doctors from many places who have logged in for this talk. It's special to have you. Also, Dr. Mario from Australia. I know it must be very late. Dr. Kaveri Nambisan from Coorg. She's logged into our old professor, Dr. Rajni Makaran. So special shout out to all of you and Dr. Yogita for being part of this. And lastly, a big shout out to the friends of Dr. Yogesh Jain who are logged in, many of them, and also the many friends of St. John's who are here. It's been an absolutely wonderful evening. Thank you, Dr. Yogesh Jain, again.
And on a closing, do you want to say something, Yogesh?
Just want to thank. No, I just want to thank. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So on a closing note, I want to say that this oration has been recorded. It's also streaming on YouTube, and the link will be shared with everybody. So for those who missed it, please share the link with them so that they get an opportunity to see this oration at a later date. And we've shared the website of Jan Swasthya Sahayog. That's where Yogesh works. And I'm sure you'll be inspired by a lot of the work, and I do hope you go to visit there. So thank you again, Yogesh. Thank you, Tony, Sanjeev, Robert, and Amita and Rakesh. And good night to all of you. Thank you for joining us. Good morning to the American counterparts, and have a fantastic weekend. Good night.